Okay, I'm here at MLG Winter Championship. I'm with Goswser.
Hello.
Okay. Actually, before we get into the tournament, I want to ask you one thing. Since you call yourself Goswser, like, have you ever thought of renaming yourself? Because here's the thing, for marketing purposes, it's really bad to have a name where it's impossible to read it and know how that would possibly be said.
I've thought about it, but like, if I change my name, then people won't know that I was Goswser. There's always like, then people watch a tournament and they see someone with a new name and they don't actually know. They won't like relate me to my old name, so that's why I haven't changed it.
But do people come up to you who've only seen it written and like, hey, Goswser?
I guess so. People mispronounce it a lot, but I don't know. I have like decent name recognition, even though it probably hurts like my Twitter followers because no one can spell it. But I've thought about changing it, but I'm not sure if it would be worth it, you know.
Okay, so coming into this tournament, before we talk about the tournament, let's just talk a little bit about Heart of the Swarm. Like, at the moment, I think a lot of the fans have no clue who's been playing a lot, who's been playing a bit. Like, I think I saw you played maybe some online tournaments in Heart of the Swarm. Like, how much have you actually played the game in beta?
I've played the game a lot. I played since a couple weeks after the beginning of beta, and I've been pretty much just playing full Heart of the Swarm since then. Between like 20 and 40 games a day, probably. Yeah, so I've been playing a lot.
I mean, if you looked at Wings of Liberty, it did seem like a lot of the players who went all in on Heart of the Swarm early on were either like the old players, like people like White Rat, etc., who aren't really playing that much competitively in Wings of Liberty, or people who'd been doing badly in tournaments and they thought like, oh, everything will be turned around and I'll be great in Heart of the Swarm. Like, what was your motivation? Had you decided, like, based on my Wings of Liberty results, I'm just going to go straight all in on Heart of the Swarm, or were you trying to keep playing tournaments at the end of the Wings of Liberty?
Well, there weren't too many big ones that I was actually in once Heart of the Swarm beta came out, between then and the release of Heart of the Swarm, and I just figured that my Wings of Liberty skill wouldn't increase enough if I kept playing Wings of Liberty to justify continuing that instead of Heart of the Swarm. And obviously you can get a bit of a head start if you start playing Heart of the Swarm earlier. In some cases, we've seen it's helped a lot, like in the case of White Rat, who's shown a lot better results since switching to Heart of the Swarm than at the end of Wings of Liberty. So,
obviously, one of the downsides of practicing in the beta is that from the beginning of the beta, quite a lot's changed over then. Like, how much of an actual benefit do you think it was to have played so much? Like, do you think you really got, like, how much of a head start do you think you got on someone, for example, like a Korean Pro League player who didn't switch until maybe like a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago?
Well, you still learn some stuff that's useful, even though a lot has changed. Like, at the beginning of beta, Swarm hosts were horrible against Terran, and now they're still horrible against Terran. So you're not wasting as much time like trying strategies that aren't actually going to work. Other than that, everything looks a bit different with the new graphics and the new physics engine. So I guess getting used to that might give you a bit of a benefit. Overall, it's not too big, but anything helps, I guess.
Since, like I mentioned, especially a lot of the people who said they were going to start Heart of the Swarm straight away were the people who were doing badly at the end of the Wings of Liberty. It was like a get out of jail free, like, oh, well, what'll happen is Heart of the Swarm will fit my style better, and, you know, I'll be a lot better in that. So I've heard this said, like, almost everyone, they think Heart of the Swarm's going to be better for them, which obviously can't be better for everyone. Based on what you know now, how would you actually evaluate how Heart of the Swarm fits your style compared to the end of Wings of Liberty?
I think that Heart of the Swarm fits my style a little more in like ZVP especially, because I don't like the turtling infestor broodlord style that most people do in ZVP. I always like to just play more aggressively and do more mid-game oriented builds, and you can't really go broodlord infestor anymore in Heart of the Swarm. So I think in this matchup it helps me. Obviously, no one's like Heart of the Swarm. I'm totally screwed now. I was only good at Wings of Liberty, even though I don't know. Maybe people in the forums say that about patch Zergs. But I think the only people it would hurt are people who don't practice as much, like people who are like studying at the same time, like Nerdshio. I think it would hurt him because he doesn't have as much time to practice, and he would have to adjust to all the new builds. So I think those are the kinds of players who it would hurt, if anyone.
Actually, that's obviously something that people mentioned, was that, I mean, if we look at the first few results, it did seem as though some of the Zergs who'd only risen up in 2012 were the ones who were doing worse. Meanwhile, like the mainstays of like Stefano, Rhett, Nerdshio, these guys still did pretty decently, it seemed like. Do you get the sense that there's going to be some Zergs who won't be able to adapt, just based on how they played in Wings of Liberty?
I don't think so, actually. I think a lot of people just aren't giving some of the Zergs credit. Like Scarlet is a great player. The other ones like Vortex and Slivko are great players too. They have really good mechanics. I think as long as they practice the new game a lot, they'll be able to adapt just fine, even though people don't give them credit for being Zergs. Obviously, none of the Zergs are going to do as good as they were at the end of Wings of Liberty, except maybe Rhett, who's shown that he is doing better. But just because Zerg is weaker right now than it was at the end of Wings of Liberty. But I think no one's going to struggle too much. If any one player, I'd say Nurchio is going to struggle the most. He was already having some difficulty with Protoss at the end of Wings of Liberty. He doesn't practice as much as other players because of school. And there's a lot of new timings that you have to learn. So, but I mean, as long as he practices a lot, he can still adapt and adjust too.
I mean, as you mentioned there, it is sort of the general consensus at the moment. I mean, the other races can argue whether Terran or Protoss is the most strongest, but pretty much everyone agrees like Zerg is the weakest at the moment. However, weak obviously is debatable. I did an interesting interview with Violet at IEM where he actually told me that by playing Heart of the Swarm, that's the first time he actually admitted to himself how good Infestors were at the end of Wings of Liberty. Because he said he used to think that people were overrating how good they were and that they were just decent. But then he said he played with the Infestor in Heart of the Swarm, and he was like, wow, those Wings of Liberty Infestors were really, really good. Like, have you had any of this sense yourself? Like, are you willing to admit there was certain strengths that maybe you weren't before in Wings of Liberty?
Yeah, in Wings of Liberty, Zerg was favored against Terran at the end. And against Protoss, I think at the end it was kind of coming to an even point. There was like times when Broodlord and Infestor put Zerg way ahead of Protoss, and then times when Protoss we were kind of figuring out like good timings to deal with that. And obviously the very late game for Zerg versus Protoss and versus Terran was pretty Zerg favored, I think, in Wings of Liberty. But overall, like ZVP was kind of okay, I think, at the end. Back to what was I'm kind of losing track of the original question here. And
do you feel as though from playing Heart of the Swarm, you've got the sense of like what was better there or what is worse in Heart of the Swarm for Zerg?
Oh, I guess so. I mean, I noticed the differences between the two games. Obviously, Infestors are a lot worse. I know they're overly strong in Wings of Liberty, but I think they're a bit weak now in HOTS. But that might not be the Infestor. It might just be the other races being much stronger than Wings of Liberty.
So, I mean, the interesting thing is, obviously, the big matchup everyone was talking about at the end of Wings of Liberty was PvZ, because either they were talking about it like the early period where all the Protoss were like, it's impossible if it goes to the late game, then the late period where the Zergs were like, oh, but if they do the Immortal Sentry all in, then what do I do? So it's like, it was very well defined as to where people had their strengths during the game. And from doing the interviews I've done so far, it sounds like it's almost flipped in Heart of the Swarm. Now the Zergs say, like, I have to kill the Protoss before he maxes out his army. Meanwhile, the Protoss say, like, if I just play more defensive and just build up, then, like, I'm in favor. How much of it do you think actually is Protoss being stronger, and how much is it the fact that people are having to sort of flip their whole style in that matchup?
I think it's just Protoss being stronger for the most part. There's still a lot of things in the mid-game especially that aren't figured out, like especially how to use Swarm Host most effectively and transitions in that period of the game. But if Protoss gets to late game, they're way, way stronger than Wings of Liberty, and it's almost impossible to beat the perfect composition now for ZVP. I think as the game gets more figured out, it'll favor the Protosses though instead of the Zergs, because like Protoss relies on really tight timings and transitions. And none of those are figured out now, so they're just kind of doing either Wings of Liberty styles or just improvising and doing stuff that isn't really figured out, so you can kind of get wins against them that way. So like right now, we'll see some Zergs, like Rhett, get wins against really notable and strong Protoss players. But once it's more figured out, I think it'll be a lot harder to win like that.
Okay, the interesting thing is, all the Zergs I talked to at IEM, except Violet, who did pretty well against the Protoss, were complaining, okay, the Protosses are too strong, like, it's favoring them at the moment. But what's interesting is the only Zerg I found who didn't say that was actually Rhett. And he said that he thought Terran was the strongest. And so the interesting thing is, people got sidetracked by the Zergs complaining about the Protosses, but all the Protosses complained about the Terrans and said, oh, yeah, it's too strong. Do you feel as though Terran is the strongest overall?
Yeah, right now, Terran's the strongest overall. It's always hard to judge exactly how much stronger each race is than the other one. Like, it can be pretty close, but if one's a bit stronger, it'll still give them a pretty good advantage in each game. I think Terran's the strongest right now, but Protoss isn't that far behind. Against Zerg, both of them are pretty good.
Okay, so in this tournament, in the first round, you play Bomber, And he's someone who's obviously, he's had success in Western tournaments, definitely. But then the strange thing is, he's one of the few people who, when he goes back to GSL, isn't really like a top tier guy. How do you evaluate him? Like, what did you think of him before you knew you were going to play him?
I think he's one of the top Korean Terrans. He struggles in GSL, but I think it's because of the styles he plays more than that he's not a good player, because he has great macro and great mechanics and great control. But he doesn't like to play standard builds as much, and I think he hurts himself because of that. But I think it'll definitely be difficult to beat him at this tournament, because I haven't seen any of his games in Heart of the Swarm, and I have no clue what he does. I know what Terran players do generally, but still there's a lot of differences from player to player.
When you have no way of actually scouting a guy's game, because obviously a big factor towards the end of Wings of Liberty is any famous player, you could watch, I mean, a year's worth of their games, you could watch almost as much as you want. If you play someone where you don't know anything about his style and he likely doesn't know anything about yours, like this situation here, are you someone who you just go with your strengths, whatever you've really been practicing a lot, or are you going to try lots of really weird surprise stuff? Like, which do you tend to veer towards, which of those extremes?
The best way I think to approach this is usually just to do the builds that you win the most with in practice against other good opponents. So if that's like, if you're always losing in like mid and late game, then you should try to end it before then. Besides that, you can read some into like how he's playing on the previous games, because if he doesn't play mech for the first 4 games of the series, he's probably not going to go at the 5th game. But a lot of it, you just kind of have to scout as well as you can and just play the styles you're strongest at, and try to end the game where you feel you can.
Okay, and if obviously we're not looking past Bomber, but you have a bracket that potentially is like maybe the hardest side of the bracket, because if you win, you could literally be playing people who are either like GSL champions or like winners of big foreign tournaments. We've got like Tasia, MVP, MC, Life, like just like an all-star list of names, obviously. Like, is it at all demotivating to know that if you were to even make it to the final, it'd be like the hardest possible run ever? Like, is it a good chance to test yourself? How are you kind of mentally framing it right now?
I'm just focusing on this one match against Bomber. If I beat Bomber, I'm almost certainly have the same matchup again in the next round against Tasia. And if I make it past 2 rounds, and in the round of 8, that's farther than I expected to go, so I'm not too worried about that. I know like Feast, for instance, has prepared some for his 2nd round opponent, but I've just focused on playing Bomber.
Okay. Here's an interesting anecdote. So when I was at IPL 5, in the press room, sometimes people would actually do interviews in the press room. So sometimes, even if I was working, I would like be forced to overhear these interviews because people were talking behind me and your brain just picks up on stuff. And I remember hearing an interview you did with a site, I forget which website, because I was just listening. And because the tournament was over and you'd finished like 17th to 24th or something, I think around that place, so you were like one of the higher foreigners, but like not high in the actual tournament.
Yeah.
And what I remember was nearly all your answers to your questions went along the lines of like, on the games I lost, like, yeah, I thought I should have won or I could have won, like I would have beaten him, and you know, I thought like this next guy or would have played in the next round, like I could have beaten him as well. You sounded like, because the tournament was over and it was like Wings of Liberty and you were feeling strong, like, oh, I should have done a lot better, like if I had my chance again, like I would do. Now you're sounding a bit down about the fact that Zerg like sucks in this game here, so like, how is your mindset at the moment going forwards in the game?
I think
changed in that sense?
Kind of. I mean, at the end of Wings, like the game is a lot more figured out. So when you lose games, you'd know like almost exactly what you could have done to win those games. But in Heart of the Swarm, because none of the builds or transitions are figured out, and you're not really sure what your opponent's going to do, it's a lot more difficult to like just be like, oh, I could have done this right here and won the game, because there's so many different situations that could occur. The mindset's also changed some because I have no clue how my opponent's going to play. It's before the tournament instead of after the tournament, so I can't really comment on what I've done wrong, except Pig Zerg. But yeah, I guess the mindset hasn't changed too much, except with the new game, it's a lot more difficult to say about how it's going to go.
If we looked at the end of Wings of Liberty, like the NA scene in terms of results was doing terribly. Like even the absolute best people, they were getting weird results, like people saying, oh, they were the best foreigner at the tournament, which meant they came like 13th, which like isn't a good result. It's good in that context, but like in the real world, placing outside the top 8 isn't really a good result, you know. Well, so what okay, do you want to say something?
Yeah, well, it hasn't been as bad as people say. Like IEMs, there's so few North Americans participating always. You're not going to have good results when you have maybe one guy out of 24 players there. At some, we've seen us do pretty well. Iron Squid, for example, we had 2 North Americans in top 8, which is pretty good for a premier tournament like that.
Online?
Yeah, but still, the Europeans didn't do any better. They did worse, actually, in that than the North Americans. But yeah, North America overall is definitely lacking.
Okay, but what I'm sort of getting to here is a lot of the people who, if you asked a random fan, okay, write down the top 10 North American players, I'm guessing at least 5 or 6 of those names probably aren't top players anymore. They just used to be top players, or they used to be good, and they still have the name value. Whereas if we look at people like you, Scarlett, let me think if there's anyone else. There's not really that many other names that people would have on that list.
Okay, Nidra probably.
Well, I'm putting them with the other names from before. Yeah. So they're probably going to be on name recognition. So at the moment, in theory, you're on that list because of actual results or people you've beaten in the last few months. So if I asked you to project forward 6 months, like, will Goswser be the best North American player?
Definitely not. Scarlett will still be the best for quite a while, I think. She's a lot better than me, especially in ZVZ right now. Even though I haven't seen too much of her in Heart of the Swarm, at the end of Wings, she was a lot better than me. And I think she's on another level from North Americans. I think she probably has the best ZVZ of any foreigner. And her other matchups, she's pretty far up there too. Yeah, so I can't see myself passing up over her anytime soon.
Well, if we talk about the 2 people you mentioned there, Huck and Idra, their results haven't really been that good. Like, they've definitely been of that sort of a result. Like, oh, I was one of the top placing North American people with the name beginning with I. It was that sort of very weird ranking of a result. So is it unreasonable to think in 6 months you could be better than them?
Better than Huck and Idra in 6 months? I think that's definitely not unreasonable. I think, I'm hoping I am better than them in 6 months. Idra, it's always hard to tell because he usually looks off his game, and a lot of his mistakes can usually be attributed to mindset, so it's hard to tell how good he actually is. On ladder, he usually does pretty well, and he has a strong ZVZ, but in tournaments and qualifiers, he often doesn't show how good he actually is. I think he's a lot better than people give him credit for. Huck, I don't see him very much. He trains in Korea. He doesn't play at that many events. I don't think anyone can say how good he is because at tournaments, when you play one player and then you're out and that's it, there's not that much to judge someone on.
Okay, so to wrap this up, do you have any final message for people who've been watching or someone you want to thank, that sort of thing?
Watch me against Bomber tomorrow, or watch me against Bomber in the past when this is posted. I have some builds I've worked on that I hope are creative and can maybe catch him off guard. I don't think I'm going to win, because even if they catch him off guard, Terran is still pretty good. But I'll try to make it interesting. Other than that, you can follow me on Twitter at Goswser, Goswser, and on Facebook at Goswser as well. Besides that, just follow my team, follow me. That's all.